Welcome to the Sabbath School lesson for April 28, 2012. The lesson we're considering today is entitled From Slave to Ruler over Egypt. I'd really like to encourage you to obtain a copy of the lesson material and to study it through yourself, to go through in detail and find the things that are precious to your own experience. If you like, you can follow a link below this video and ascertain and print off a copy of the Sabbath School lesson there. From slave to ruler over Egypt. This lesson deals with the life of Joseph, the lessons that he learnt, the victories he gained, and how the Lord was able to bless him in his life. The experience of the life of Joseph is one that comes to us with the important message in being faithful in all points. Being faithful in the small things in life in order to receive a greater blessing, in order to be a greater blessing to others. And the life of Joseph, as I'm sure most of us are reasonably familiar with the life of Joseph. Joseph grew up in the care of his father's household. He was a young man when he was sold into slavery, probably still in his late teenage years. And Joseph was the second youngest of 12 boys. And of these 12 boys, Joseph and Benjamin, the youngest two, were without doubt the favourite sons. Jacob really loved these two boys because they were children of the wife that he loved, the children of Rachel. Now, between Joseph and his brothers, there was a great deal of animosity. And this animosity, this tension is brought out under question 1. In the Bible text under question 1 in Genesis 37, it says that Joseph dreamed a dream and he revealed that dream to his brothers. And this happened twice. Twice he revealed the dream to his brothers. And and the nature of the dream was of a nature that caused his brothers to hate him. And we read there that dream in Genesis 37 under question 1. It says, Joseph is recounting his dream. It says, "For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said unto him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams." Consider that even before Joseph had these dreams, Joseph received the coat of many colours. There was an emphasis in the life of these 12 boys that Joseph and Benjamin were especially favoured. And here it says that his brothers hated him yet the more because of his dreams. And for his words. Not only for his dreams, but also for his words. Because maybe it wasn't the wisest thing for Joseph to reveal the dreams to his brethren. Maybe it would have been wiser for him to keep quiet. But nevertheless, the dreams were from God. And the second dream, he reveals yet another dream. And he told his brethren and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren. And his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come and bow down ourselves before thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him. But what does it say about his father? His father observed the saying. Now we have to remember that in that day and age, in the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, God spoke to the faithful through dreams. It was different to us having dreams today. In their time, a dream had special import, was very important. And this dream that Joseph received, his father, Jacob, knew that there was a special message in that dream. Although it says that he rebuked him, no doubt Jacob told Joseph, Joseph, don't talk about that. Leave it alone. It's causing trouble. It's causing tension in the family. But Jacob, in his heart, observed the saying, and he realized that God had a very special mission in store for Joseph. And it was, though, that his brethren envied him and hated him because of the dreams, but also because Joseph was one of the favorites. Joseph was given special attention in the family, special care, a special measure of love, perhaps. And this was causing tension in the family, until to the point where they wanted to kill Joseph. The 11 brethren, they wanted to kill Joseph. They were sick of him, they were tired of hearing about him, and they wanted to put him to death. But ultimately, rather than put him to death, they settled to sell him as a slave to Egypt. It says in the note there, under question 1, it says, "It was envy that moved the brethren of Joseph to sell him as a slave. They hoped to prevent him from becoming greater than themselves. And when he was carried to Egypt, they flattered themselves that they were to be no more troubled with his dreams, that they had removed all possibility of fulfillment. But their own course was overruled by God to bring about the very event that they designed to hinder." Now, if Joseph hadn't been sold as a slave to Egypt, then the dreams that Joseph had dreamed would never have come to pass, because Joseph would never have been a ruler in Egypt. So the very fact that the brothers sold him into Egypt to get rid of Joseph, so that they could make sure that these dreams could never come to pass, that very act caused the dreams to become a possibility. It was God working, even through the wicked actions of these brethren. God was working through that to bring about good, to bring about even good to these brethren. We see that the life of Joseph in Egypt was not one of pleasure and ease. Although he was faithful in his duties, it was not altogether an easy road that he had to travel. But consider the similarities that are drawn between the life of Jesus and the life of Joseph. Now, these similarities are very distinct, very marked. And under question 2, we read in the text there in Matthew 27, verse 17 and 18, where Pilate is talking, and Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. The Jews, who were of the same household of faith as Jesus, even his own brother, Judas, who was not a literal brother, but was of the immediate family of Jesus, one of the disciples, the closest unto Jesus, one of those had sold Jesus into slavery, so to speak. Sold Jesus to be taken to trial, to be taken away in bondage, in fetters. And it was because of envy that this whole thing came about in Jesus' life. The Jews were envious of Jesus. They were envious that Jesus' popularity would rise too great and that they themselves would be humbled as a result. The similarities between Joseph and Jesus, both were sold to the heathen. Both were taken captive and surrendered to the heathen. In Jesus' case, to the Romans, to be tried and put to death. In Joseph's case, to the Ishmaelites and then to Egypt. Both were betrayed by family. Joseph by his brethren, with Jesus by his disciple. Both were sold for In one case 20 pieces of silver, in the other case 30 pieces of silver. Both were betrayed because of envy. Both, the betrayal was in order to prevent the person, Jesus or Joseph, from becoming too great. And in both cases, God overruled, as we read in the note there, God overruled, and by the very selling of the person into bondage, into fetters, into chains, by that very act, that uplifted them to a new measure of greatness. In the case of Joseph, because he was put in a position where he could prove his faithfulness in Egypt and ultimately become the ruler over Egypt. In the case of Jesus, because he could prove his faithfulness to the cross and as a result become a ruler over us on the throne of David as King of Israel. These similarities are really beautifully brought out in this note under question 2. It says, the life of Joseph illustrates the life of Christ. So the Jewish priests and elders were jealous of Christ, fearing that he would attract the attention of the people from them. They put him to death to prevent him from becoming king, but they were thus bringing about this very result. As Joseph was sold to the heathen by his own brothers, so Christ was sold to the bitterest enemies by one of his disciples. Joseph was falsely accused and thrust into prison because of his virtue. So Christ was despised and rejected because of his righteous, self-denying life was a rebuke to sin. And though guilty of no wrong, he was condemned upon the testimony of false witnesses. And Joseph's patience and meekness under injustice and oppression, his ready forgiveness and noble benevolence towards his unnatural brothers represents the Saviour's uncomplaining endurance of the malice and abuse of wicked men, and his forgiveness not only of his murderers, but of all who have come to him, confessing their sins and seeking pardon. This forgiving nature, the forgiving spirit, the love that presided in the heart of Jesus and Joseph. In Joseph, he truly represented the character of Christ in his spirit towards his brethren. He had indeed learned that important lesson. And it's interesting, if you read the text in between, I don't believe the actual text is given in the lesson here, but if you read the whole text there in Genesis chapter 37, where it talks about the Ishmaelites that took Joseph down to Egypt. It's interesting that those Ishmaelites, where did they come from? They came from Gilead. And what were they carrying? They were merchantmen. They were carrying balm. They were carrying the balm of Gilead. Now consider that Christ himself is referred to as the balm of Gilead. So as Joseph travelled, being sold as a slave by his brothers, the emotion, the feeling, the hurt that would naturally well up inside him, that those hurts were appeased and were healed by the balm of Gilead, Jesus Christ himself. And as the balm of Gilead, in a literal sense, travelled with them down to Egypt as merchandise, but the spiritual balm of Gilead, Jesus Christ himself, travelled with Joseph in his heart and healed his hurts so that he could love and be compassionate and be faithful in his duties in Egypt. His faithfulness in his duties in Egypt caused him to become the head servant, so to speak, of his master's house, Potiphar's house. And it came to pass that Potiphar's wife, it says, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Here, a new temptation came across Joseph. This is under question 3. This new temptation came to Joseph not all of a sudden, but gradually it built up. No doubt Joseph was probably in Egypt for several years already, gradually building his way up in his master's household until he had been entrusted with everything in the household, and everything was given to him. All liberties, everything in the household was given to him except for his wife. His master Potiphar didn't allow him, of course, to have access to his wife. But she, being a wicked woman, being a heathen, her mindset was different. And it says she cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Now, when this temptation came to Joseph, it's interesting what the note tells us. What actually happened behind the scenes as this temptation came to Joseph? It says, "But Joseph's faith and integrity were to be tested by fiery trials. His master's wife endeavored to entice the young man to transgress the law of God. Heretofore, he had remained untainted by the corruption teeming in that heathen land. But this temptation, so sudden, so strong, so seductive, how should it be met? Joseph knew well that what would be the consequence of resistance. On the one hand were concealment, favor, and rewards. On the other, disgrace, imprisonment, perhaps death. His whole future life depended upon the decision of the moment. What would principle triumph? Would Joseph still be true to God? With inexpressible anxiety, angels looked upon the scene. Perhaps you have found yourself in a similar situation to that of Joseph, where all of a sudden, such a sudden, strong, seductive temptation comes your way. How do we react? How do we respond? It says that the angels observe with inexpressible anxiety, wondering, will we be true to principle, or will we give way to temptation? Joseph had the two options before him. He could weigh it up. On the one hand, if he yielded to this woman's desires, then they would need to conceal this thing from his master, from Potiphar. But the favor and the rewards that Joseph already enjoyed, being favored in this household, that would be able to continue. But he also knew that if he was true to principle and said, "No, I will not go along with this great evil," then the result would be that she would be offended, and without doubt, the result would be disgrace, imprisonment, and perhaps death for Joseph. Faithfulness to principle often brings about disastrous consequences that we cannot foresee a way out of. Joseph in this situation would not have been able to see a way out of that dark alley that lay ahead of him. To be true to principle would prove to send him in a direction where he thought, "I cannot be a blessing to anyone anymore." Would Joseph still be true to God when being loyal to principle had only the foresight of darkness and gloom ahead? No positive outcome, no way of being a blessing to others. Question 4 deals with the element that gave Joseph the victory. It says in Hebrews 11 verse 6, under question 4, it says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him." It is impossible to please God without faith. "For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." Joseph had faith. And Joseph's faith told him that God will reward him if Joseph will diligently seek God in this hour of trial. So if Joseph would be true to principle, if principle would triumph in this moment of decision, Joseph knew that his God would reward him for being faithful to principle. And that reward, to see that reward, even though everything before him was only darkness, to see that reward took faith. Because faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. By faith, Joseph obtained a good report. It says, by faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. Joseph is recognized as one of the heroes of faith because he found himself in a circumstance of life where being true to principle meant only darkness before him, no positive outcome. Remember, he was a Hebrew in a heathen land, in a land full of idolaters where no one worshipped the God of heaven. And in this climate, in this society, the society of corruption, of wickedness, of base idolatry, in this society, to be true to the God of heaven, for him, as a slave in that country, meant only death. In this circumstance, what was Joseph's answer to his master's wife? His answer is found there in Genesis 39, verse 8 and 9. It says, but he refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not or knoweth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater than in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Consider here that Joseph's first priority was loyalty to God. Joseph's first thought was, I will not sin against God. It wasn't, I don't want to do this because of the consequences. He didn't think, I don't want to do this because my master will throw me into prison. He didn't think, I don't want to do this because of whatever other reasons. His one focus, his one priority was, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? How often people do things in the privacy of their own home that they would never do if other people were present. If friends or family were present. They would never do that. And yet in the privacy of their own home, they continue to do these whatever cherished little idols that they have. And yet, the concept that we need to grasp is that when we indulge in our own way, we do this great wickedness and sin against God. Is our religion based on looking good in front of our brothers and sisters? If it is, no real heart surrender is necessary. No real conversion of the heart is necessary. Only putting on a clean coat on the outside, and everyone will see what a good brother, what a good sister. But God wants to work much deeper in our hearts. He wants us to consider that when we do wrong, whether it is in front of a multitude or whether it is in the privacy of our own home, we sin against the God of heaven. And this concept that we are grieving God, that we are causing God to sorrow, to weep even, this needs to be our motivating force in order to give our heart to the Lord so that He can purify and perfect us. The note there under question 4 says, loyalty to God, faith in the unseen was Joseph's anchor. In this lay the hiding of his power. Where was his power found? Where was it? How was it possible that Joseph could, through this severe, sudden and seductive trial, be so faithful, be so proper in his response, to so accurately guard against temptation? His power came from his loyalty to God and his faith in the unseen. He knew and believed full well that God was right there with him, observing. As it said, the angels looked with inexpressible anxiety upon the scene. He knew, God is here with me. watching, what shall I answer? Will I be true to principle, or will I yield and deviate from the path of right? This same scenario is played out before us every time we face a temptation. Every time a trial comes our way, the Lord watches. Will we be faithful? Will we yield to Him? Or will we yield to the temptation and to the tempter? This is something that we need to consider. Where is our loyalty? Is our loyalty to looking good in front of men? Then our private life will not be reformed, will not be sanctified. But if our loyalty is to God, and God is present everywhere, then God is able to work in the secret chambers of our heart to bring about a thorough reformation. By their wisdom and justice, by the purity, this is continuing reading under question 4 in the note, by their wisdom and justice, by the purity and benevolence of their daily life, by their devotion to the interests of the people, and they, idolaters, Joseph and Daniel, proved themselves true to the principles of their early training, true to Him whose representative they were. Joseph and Daniel found themselves in very similar situations when they were both in a heathen land. Both were called to face a trial, a test, where it seemed that death would be the outcome as a result of standing faithfully. And yet, they stood faithfully, and the Lord preserved them from death and honored them above all else. When Daniel faced the lion's den, he was true to principle that he would not deviate from his service to God, and faced the lions, and God brought him out of the lion's den, and he was prime minister over that country, like unto Joseph. And we'll consider his story some more. If we come over to question 6 in the lesson, Joseph, the storyline of Joseph, after he said to his master's wife, "How can I do this wickedness and sin against God?" she gave false testimony about him. And as a result, Joseph was cast into prison. And for several years, Joseph was in prison. And the question under question 6 asks, how did God intervene to accomplish His great purpose, and also to set Joseph free from his terrible trial and suffering? And the text there says that Pharaoh had a dream. And the dream that Pharaoh had was one which would prepare the way to cause Joseph to be honored as a result of his faithfulness. But even before Pharaoh had this dream, God had to prepare the way in the prison with 2 other dreams that He had given to 2 men. And then the interpretation that God gave to Joseph, the interpretation of both came to pass. And so, as the butler ministered in the court of Pharaoh again, here, when Pharaoh had this dream, the dream is outlined in this text in Genesis 41, verse 1 to 8. It says, "And I beheld, there came up out of the river 7 well-favoured kine or cows, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favoured and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favoured and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favoured and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream." And then what did Pharaoh do? After the custom of their country, "And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, and there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. And at this point, the butler remembered, a few years before, when he was in prison, there was a man there. His name was Joseph. And he gave me an interpretation to my dream that came to pass. And so Pharaoh then sent and called for Joseph. In Genesis 41:14-16, Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and shaved himself. And he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Here again, just like Daniel, Joseph referred all honor and glory to the God of heaven. He took no honor for himself, no glory for himself. Joseph said, God will give an interpretation. It is not of me. It is not in me to give the answer. God will give the answer. Joseph's reply to the king reveals his humility and his faith in God. Joseph's faith in God, that God would now at this time also give an answer, that caused him to be humble. Because Joseph realized that he of himself cannot do anything. Joseph realized that he could give a superficial answer to the dream, but it wouldn't accomplish anything. It wouldn't be accurate. And so it was that Joseph revealed, that God revealed through Joseph to Pharaoh the meaning of the dream. That 7 plenteous years would come to Egypt, and after that 7 years of the worst famine they had ever faced. And Joseph encouraged Pharaoh to appoint someone over the kingdom who can oversee the provisions of the 7 good years, so that storehouses could be built and reserves could be laid up to have grain in the 7 years of famine. And we read in the text under question 7, where Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? What does this heathen Pharaoh know about where the Spirit of God is? What does he know? He knows what Joseph himself had told him. Joseph had told him that the answer does not come from me. The answer is from God. God will give the vision, the answer of the dream to Pharaoh. And so, as Joseph gave verbally the answer, Pharaoh knew that God was working through the life of Joseph, that God was dwelling in him and working through him. As a result of Joseph's faithfulness in the small duties, firstly in Potiphar's house, secondly also in prison, when all hope of a positive future seemed bleak and impossible to see any light at the end of the tunnel, Joseph's faithfulness in those circumstances led him to be a ruler over Egypt. Indeed, we read that just as Christ dwelt and went with Joseph in his life, in his personal life, the same is applicable to us. Consider the note with me under question 4, the second part of the note that we haven't read yet. It says there, How precious is the thought that we may indeed become partakers of the divine nature. Joseph was made partaker of the divine nature. He in whom the Spirit of God is. He who revealed the humility of Christ. He who revealed the love, the compassion, the sympathy, the faithfulness, being so dutiful in small activities of daily life, those character traits which are the character traits of Christ. Thereby we may overcome as Christ overcame. As we are partakers of the divine nature, we may overcome as Christ overcame. Jesus is the fullness of our expectation. He is the melody of our song, the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Joseph found himself in a weary land, spiritually weary. He had no spiritual encouragement around him, nothing. He was in a heathen land with not a single worshipper of the God of heaven. That indeed was a very weary land. But in that weary land, what did he find? One big rock. And that rock cast a shadow that he would not be scorched by the heat of the sun. That rock is Jesus Christ. Jesus is the shadow of a great rock in a weary land, it says. He is living water to the thirsty soul. He is our refuge in the storm. He is our righteousness, our sanctification, our redemption. That's from That I May Know Him, page 166. A very precious passage in Spirit of Prophecy. Christ is our refuge in the storm. When Joseph faced the storm of temptation, he found by faith that Jesus Christ was his refuge, and that though he saw no light at the end of the darkness, no positive outcome as a result, as a potential result of his faithfulness, yet he had faith in the unseen. He trusted that God was more pleased with obedience than with anything else in the world. And so it is that Joseph's personal life is a powerful testimony and witness to us. The note under question 5 really brings it home on a personal level, and I'd like to conclude with this note. The note under question 5 says, Joseph's religion kept his temper sweet and his sympathy with humanity warm and strong, notwithstanding all his trials. There are those who, if they feel they are not rightly used, become sour, ungenerous, crabbed, and uncourteous in their words and deportment. They sink down discouraged, hateful, and hating others. But Joseph was a Christian. Are you a Christian? This is my question today. Are you a Christian? Circumstances will come our way that will bring trials in such a way that our flesh, our natural nature, our natural disposition which leads to corruption, our emotions, our feeling will be sour thoughts will come, sour feelings, uncourteous thoughts. But do we yield to those and express that to those around us? Or do we quash that as did Joseph, when it says that Joseph's religion kept his temper sweet? He was always pleasant. He was always courteous. He was always kind to those around him, even if they abused him, even if they were unkind to him, even if they, as it says there, if Joseph was not rightly used. Sometimes we believe, such and such doesn't appreciate me for what I can do. I put all this effort in and no one appreciates it. And we become sour about it. But there are those who, if they feel they are not rightly used, become sour and uncourteous and ungenerous. But Joseph was not like that. Joseph was a Christian. Reading on, it says, God was preparing him under this discipline for a situation of great responsibility, honor, and usefulness, and he was willing to learn. He took kindly to the lessons the Lord would teach him. He learned to bear the yoke in his youth. He learned to govern by first learning obedience himself. Joseph learned and was prepared to govern the country of Egypt. How? By learning obedience in his own personal life, by being able to say no to the fierce temptations as they came his way, by being able to stand up and say, even though I don't see any positive outcome here, I will trust God. And that is the end of the matter. I will just trust God. Because Joseph had this attitude, this spirit, this faith, which comes through Christ. He had that relationship with Christ. Therefore, he was prepared to govern the country. He learned to bear the yoke in his youth, to be faithful in the small duties, to be faithful in the temptations that came his way. The question to you today is, are you a Christian? Let us be faithful in every point that comes our way. No matter how unpleasant, no matter how dark the future of faithfulness might be, no matter what the outcome or the consequences of standing up for right, standing up for truth, let us do the Lord's will. Let us be faithful. Let us be Christians. Amen.